Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing plenary for the California Adaptation Forum this year, which will be focused on accelerating adaptation equitably and intentionally. I imagine we'll have more folks joining us, but we have quite a bit to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Julia Kim. I am the Climate Change and Energy Program Director for the Local Government Commission, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, I just wanted to run through some logistics. Everyone is muted just due to how many folks are joining us today, but we do encourage folks to share questions at any point throughout today's webinar using the Zoom Q&A module for the panel discussion later today. Please also take full advantage of the Zoom chat function. Everyone should be able to fully use the chat module, so please, we encourage you to introduce yourselves, your name, your organization, where you're calling in from, and please feel free to chat John Vandervoort or myself if you have any questions throughout the webinar about the California Adaptation Forum series. I want to thank all of our forum sponsors for making this year's CAF series possible. Wanted to call out Southern California Medicine as our champion level sponsor, and to all of our sponsors, your generous support made this event possible this year, so thank you again. And thank you also to all of our promotional partners for helping us extend our reach and bring new voices and perspectives into the CAF community. So the California Adaptation Forum this year was organized as a 5-month virtual series across 3 cross-cutting tracks, which focused on advancing equitable adaptation, integrated planning for holistic solutions, and catalyzing meaningful adaptation action. Participants from across the state gathered to explore the grand adaptation challenges that they face and discuss ongoing efforts, new ideas, emerging opportunities to overcome these challenges equitably and creatively. Throughout the workshop series, we explored quite a bit, how white supremacy is showing up in the workplace and how it affects our work as adaptation practitioners, how we can balance the need to move quickly to meet the demands of a changing climate with the slower and intentional process of building relationships and embedding equity into our work. We explore the cascading and compounding nature of climate change impacts, as well as regional planning and collaboration, and some of the major questions that continue to linger, like how we define regions, who should be leading regional planning, and how we hold ourselves accountable to advancing regional priorities. We organize scenario-based exercises to create, for participants to create project concepts in a Shark Tank style session, more scenario-based exercises to create community engagement strategies and design outreach materials. We hosted a project troubleshooting lab where real-world project challenges were presented, participants collaborated to identify potential solutions, and so much more. And critical to this series were all of our track facilitators. So I wanted to take a moment to thank all of the facilitators for volunteering their time to create a really meaningful experience for adaptation practitioners throughout the state to connect, exchange ideas, and build community. So our track 1 facilitators, Jose, Monica, Nick. For track 2, we had Whitney, Peggy, and Rima. And then finally for track 3, we had Ignacio, Ben, and Melody. So huge thanks to all of our facilitators for working with us throughout the past 5 months. I also want to recognize the core planning team who's working behind the scenes to make this event possible. So our partners over at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Julia and Nikki, thank you for being such great partners and jumping in to lend a helping hand throughout this series, and to Kelsey and John for all of the support that you provided over the past 5 months. Before we jump into our presentations, I wanted to share a few key takeaways that emerged throughout the series this year. First being that the common adaptation challenges that we're already aware of continue to persist and become increasingly complex to address. So limited funding and staff capacity, I'm sure folks have heard this time and time again, or this is something that you're experiencing yourself. These remain as the most significant barriers and commonly experienced barriers in the adaptation field. This includes funding for sustaining existing efforts, as well as for new projects, and for staff positions and coordination across departments and sectors and jurisdictional boundaries. These challenges become increasingly complex, with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and impacts that this is having to communities as well as to adaptation practitioners in our work. Climate change impacts are worsening, and the cost for action, the needed costs to act and respond continue to grow. We also heard calls for preserving our current workforce by promoting personal resilience and supporting our existing adaptation community. Adaptation practitioners need actionable research guidance, strategies, and technical assistance. So we know the climate challenges we're facing are already complex. Just given the interconnected, uncertain nature of climate change and how it's impacting all aspects of society and life. To add to this complexity, our sectors are siloed, community needs are diverse and constantly evolving, new policies and mandates are being adopted each year. There are staff and leadership changes that can be challenging to navigate, and so much more. Involve principles and frameworks for equitable adaptation, for vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning are helpful. Adaptation practitioners are looking for more concrete guidance and tools that are more actionable and tangible. And this is particularly important given ongoing capacity constraints and limited staff time to translate the more general guidance that's been coming out. Standardized metrics, demonstration projects, and long-term monitoring are critical to continuing to mature the adaptation field. So throughout the series, participants were not short of ideas when it comes to adaptation solutions and projects that could be implemented. However, there's so much more work that needs to go into kind of making these projects possible and come to life. So there was also hesitancy to be first. So by investing in demonstration projects and monitoring and standardizing metrics, we can build more confidence in the various industries that need to be involved in bringing new projects online. We also heard from folks that new evaluation systems are needed, going beyond economic evaluation, just to ensure that adaptation investments do lead to equitable outcomes for our most marginalized communities. We must reach new heights of collaboration to meaningfully involve and empower communities, decision makers, and stakeholders. So communities need to be involved in a meaningful way in adaptation planning in order to produce actionable plans that meet community needs, empower action and collaboration, and build public support for climate resilient solutions. We all know that there is great urgency to adapt, but building trust, repairing relationships, and creating lasting partnerships takes time. And doing that work to engage and meaningfully involve communities and other stakeholders, investing in that time earlier on can pave the way for a coordinated action moving forward. We also heard calls for more intentional efforts to co-create adaptation solutions with communities, forming meaningful partnerships with trusted community-based organizations, and revamping decision-making structures and processes to enable communities to have a meaningful voice. We also know that coordination and collaboration is critical. However, these are often unfunded, and it's kind of a shift in that funding paradigm is needed to move forward. By transforming institutional structures and practices, we can overcome some key barriers to adaptation planning and action. So we know that more funding is needed, but the way in which available funds are currently structured can limit our ability to advance adaptation practice. Some of that comes from some local agencies being constrained by their more narrowly defined agency missions, or sector-specific agencies that have legal restrictions that make it challenging to fund multi-sector efforts, the siloed nature of agencies and organizations, creating internal competition for resources, and a mismatch in the long-term research and evaluation needed, and funding programs often being focused on more short-term results and metrics. Participants also discussed the need to revamp recruitment and hiring practices and traditional budgeting and planning processes in order to address systemic racism, which within the workplace and which inevitably impacts our work with communities. Throughout the series, we heard that innovative adaptation approaches and solutions are being implemented throughout California, whether those are community-driven solutions, agency-led solutions, spanning community engagement to planning to implementation, assessments and research and monitoring, new financing mechanisms. We're seeing tremendous progress throughout the state, and ongoing opportunities to build community, to sustain ongoing knowledge exchange and collaboration will be key to ensure that we're moving forward in the direction that we need to collectively. So these are just a handful of some of the key takeaways that emerged. We'll be sharing all of these takeaways and more, including all the presentations and recordings, various Jamboard exercises that we led throughout the workshop series with everyone. So stay tuned. Next week, we'll be posting all of that with the recording from today's session so that everyone has access to that. So it is my pleasure to now introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Jackie Patterson, who will speak to climate adaptation in the context of the syndemic, historic systemic underpinnings, call for visionary transformational solutions. Jacqueline Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. Most recently, Patterson served as a senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for 11 years. Patterson's publications include Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation, an Indicators document, and chapters in the book Building Community Resilience Post-Disaster. Patterson holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us today. We also have Michelle Bassel, who will be speaking to the Dishkama Humboldt, an Indigenous-led community land trust for community resilience, healing, and liberation. Michelle serves as the tribal administrator of the Wiyot tribe, who has stewarded the land in and around Humboldt Bay in Northern California since time immemorial. As tribal administrator, she is responsible for planning, managing, and directing of the tribal government. Rather long list of activities, I will admit. She was active in the historical return of the Tulalot Island, the fight to protect ancestral territory, and served on the board of directors of Cooperation Humboldt. Thank you, Michelle, so much for joining us today. She's also joined by David Cobb, who will be co-presenting. David is a people's lawyer who has sued corporate polluters, lobbied elected officials, run for political office himself, and has even been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. He believes we must provoke and win a peaceful revolution if we are to survive. David is the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and serves as the Collaborative Design Council of Transition U.S. He is also on the board of advisors of the California Progressive Alliance, active with the California Public Banking Alliance, and serves as the director of Cooperation Humboldt. Thanks so much, David, for joining us. We're also joined by Nuantara Key, who will be sharing about California's investments in equitable adaptation. Nuantara Key is the Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, and Chair of the Technical Advisory Council for the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. Prior to joining OPR, Nuantara co-founded an international initiative on community-based worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors on sustainable urban and regional planning and policy with a focus on social equity and climate change. She has a master's of urban and regional planning from Portland State University and a bachelor's from Lewis and Clark College. Thanks so much, Nuantara, for joining. And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing funding opportunities for climate adaptation from Katie Lepiki. I'm so sorry, Katie. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Katie is the director of the Mitigation Division for FEMA Region 9, office in Oakland, California. Prior to joining Region 9 in 2020, Katie was the Hazard Mitigation Division Director in Puerto Rico, supporting recovery efforts for Hurricanes Irma and Maria and the 2020 earthquakes. She holds a Master of Science in Urban Planning from Columbia University in New York City, where she concentrated in housing policy, and a Bachelor's of Arts in Historical Preservation and American Studies from Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland. So as you can see, we have quite the exciting panel here today. And with that, I will turn it right over to you, Jackie, for the first presentation. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be able to kick off this conversation, and I appreciate the theme of the forum in terms of accelerating adaptation equitably and intentionally. So, really thinking about intent and thinking about equity in a deeply intentional way. One of the things that we often talk about in this work is how equitable adaptation shouldn't just be about accommodating and catering to the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities. It should be about actually eliminating those vulnerabilities and the systemic basis for the marginalization. Thank you, Dave. So as such, when we think about this work, it needs to be in that kind of, in the vein of that type of systemic transformational way of thinking. Last year on March the 9th, I was on a little mini vacation and watching CNN and seeing the beginnings of this conversation about COVID-19. And at that point, it was largely talking about Wuhan province. And then it was also the Kirkland nursing home in Washington state. And at that point, people were just beginning to get a sense that it was going to be big, but it was just literally in the US, they were focusing on that Kirkland nursing home situation. And so I decided to sat down in my laptop, and 19 hours later, I had written this document called The 10 Equity Implications of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And the fact that everything that was in there came to be was not because I was an oracle, it was some kind of prophecy. It was really because any of the folks who are on this panel, any of the folks who are on the front lines of this work could have predicted what was happening, because we all have seen kind of the well-worn tread of the systemic inequities that are the basis for, as I talk about this syndemic, the environmental justice community is talking a lot about this notion of the syndemic in terms of where we are with these colliding crises and intersectional colliding crises that we're facing here. So the economic crisis, the racial awakening, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the climate crisis all have these same systemic underpinnings in terms of the patterns of disproportionate impact. And so it was easy to write a document that said that racism, that hate crimes, that would proliferate. It was easy to write a document that said that people were going to capitalize on the political gain, as well as the response would be a politically, or lack thereof, would be a politically driven situation. It was easy to say that people who were incarcerated, people who were in various other types of housing situations that were closely situated, that people on the front lines in terms of workers where their work would be valued, but them as workers would not be properly protected. It was easy to see all that because we've seen it time and time again, whether it was the BP oil drilling disaster, the Hurricane Katrina, the flooding, and the tornadoes of 2011. We just see it time and time again. In any kind of disaster and any kind of shock to society, it lays bare the systemic inequities. There's I was on a panel with this person, Steve Benjamin, the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, and he said that COVID-19 was like an X-ray that exposed the broken bones of American society, and that's exactly what was true. And so when we think about those underpinnings in the United States, we know that there's this kind of romanticized notion of these explorers or adventurers who came to Turtle Island here, the land that's now called the United States, quote unquote, seeking spices. So right away, even in their mission, they came to take from the land, really in the beginning of an extractive economy. And then they took the land itself and established this kind of notion of dominion over land and over people. And there again is the basis for this extractive economy. So we saw where, again, contrary to these romanticized ways that it's spoken about, it was really murder. It was theft, it was displacement, that was the founding principles and practices of greed, of this false notion of scarcity, that they can only be well if they were oppressing others, that this nation was founded on. And so then went over to sub-Saharan Africa and put people as cargo in ships to then become the labor, the enslaved labor that built the infrastructure of this nation, and then became the generational wealth for people who are still in power and wealth now, while people were taken away from their own culture, their own land, their own homes, and their own families, and what would have been their generational wealth to then become property, enslaved property. And so as we move forward, we see how that kind of extraction, exploitation, domination then became the modus operandi, and then also became institutionalized by various policies, whether it's the Homestead and Morrill Acts that gave further advantage to basically white landowners and so forth, while people who were emancipated had such a hard time getting land, and certainly didn't even have the wherewithal to write legal wills to pass land down. So these are where we start to see the vulnerabilities that persist to today. We know that kind of separation from access to land was continued through redlining, and we know how this shows up today in terms of people who are more likely to be in floodplains. And so when we see the flooding that comes through, we're at this point with climate change where the 100-year flood is happening on the regular. The communities that are the descendants from those, the people who were brought over and as cargo and ships are the folks who are again in harm's way in these situations. Then we have the institutionalization of policies like our levee system, where after Hurricane Matthew, when I was in Louisiana, they asked Senator Mary Landrieu why it was that the levees weren't reinforced 7 years after Hurricane Katrina. And they said, well, we use a formula to decide which levees are going to be prioritized for reinforcement. The Army Corps of Engineers said this. And they said that they apply points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if that levee was overtaken. So again, in some sense, if someone's only narrowly thinking of one piece, and you think about kind of a cost benefit analysis, that it's about kind of maintaining costs. So of course, they're going to protect the areas where it'll be most costly, but it's literally institutionalizing racism. It's institutionalizing classism, because it means that by definition, the folks who have the highest property values are going to be the people that are protected. So even though, and so we don't think of, our policy making isn't incorporating people. It's really being planned around property and property values and profit. We think about, again, with the history of redlining and the food insecurity that happens in communities. They talk about, people don't like the term food deserts, because deserts are something that occur naturally in nature, but the food apartheid is what people often say, and the separation from healthy and nutritious foods is something that happens because by design. And so when we think about the shift in agricultural yields from climate change, that becomes again even more solidified. As we think about climate forced migration, I was working in a place called Laredo, where one of these border communities, and they were saying that the bulk of the people who are coming across are because their land is drying up, because disaster is driving them from their land, and so forth. And yet when they come to this land, to the United States, then they're greeted with cages or with reins that are turned into whips. Even though we're 4% of the global population and 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, not to mention US imperialist actions otherwise. So we're the ones who are driving people from their land. And yet when they come seeking just opportunity to be able to feed their families and so forth, then this is how we greet them. There was a Kenyan-born Somali poet who said that no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And so these are the kinds of situations that we find ourselves in when we think about the underpinnings, when we think about the inequities, and we think about the reality of the tough situations in which people find themselves. So in my remaining 3 minutes, the good news is that there is another way. And so I want to end on a positive note, in that We know that as climate adaptation practitioners, as you've spoken about already, it was great to see the summary. We can find hope in a living economy. We can find hope in community leadership. The HAMES principles provide the guideline for us. Let the people speak for themselves. Practicing bottom-up organizing, practicing self-transformation, being in mutuality, and so we know that there's ways that we can organize together that really prioritizes frontline leadership. We know that acknowledging intersectionality and engaging in multi-solving, so that we just don't look at things like solving for controlling finances without looking at people. We don't just when we put together our programming, we think about the ways that we can solve for both whatever the problem is at hand, but also the driver of the problem. We have to practice radical imagination, not in a utopian kind of unattainable sense, but radical imagination that has enabled us to reach as far as we have in terms of innovation and progress. We have to ground our solutions in transformation, as I said before, making sure that we are thinking about ways to not just put a Band-Aid on the system, but actually transform the system so that the Band-Aids, we can throw out the package of Band-Aids altogether. And then we need to be thinking about centering in a living economy values and practices of regeneration, caring for the sacred, honoring, treasuring, and preserving and protecting ecological well-being. Thank you, David. Cooperation, living in cooperation, and advancing deep inclusive democracy. I can't believe I only have 1 minute left because I have 12 models I was going to share with you. But anyway, so I'll just say it's already happening. The Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York, Earthseed Permaculture in California, practicing local food work. Homa Nation and the intertribal partners from the Belbuncha Collective and the Gulf South are securing and growing food and medicinal herbs for their communities. We, the people of Detroit, are ensuring water security. The Gullah Geechee Nation is working with groups like Climate Central to develop an app for community-led work on sea level rise. Kristen Brown of Honolulu is engaging in narrative strategy to engage her youth in Honolulu about saving the oceans and preserving the environment. The Holding Institute in Laredo, Texas has developed an aquaponics program to actually train people who are coming in across the border so that they can actually be gainfully employed, as well as having installed a 96-panel solar installation on their facility. In Puerto Rico, the Alliance for Renewable Energy now is really fighting now with FEMA, who has approved the building back a fossil fuel infrastructure. And they're saying, if we want to build back better, it needs to be a renewable energy system. The Climate Justice Alliance is pushing for just recovery and recognizing that it means that we're defining managed retreat in terms of equity and justice and designing truly community-led processes to advance these discussions. The Regenesis Project and Crenshaw Rising are developing whole community models. Democracy Initiative and Move to Amend are getting money out of politics. The Institute for Policy Studies is providing recommendations on adjusting spending priorities in terms of shifting from the billions spent on military proliferation to putting money into community-led solutions. And We Act is training communities on participatory budgeting so we can actually have meaningful involvement. So finally, if we follow this path that the ecosystem models for us, the path of biomimicry, the path that communities who are already in motion have paved for us, we can really live up to these tenets of liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I imagine you have not been able to follow the chat, but I would encourage you to check it out. Folks are, a lot of positive response. Some folks can hear you talk for hours. So thank you so much. That was a lot that you covered in a short amount of time. I'm going to keep things moving along, and wanted to invite Michelle and David to our virtual stage to share more about Dishkama Humboldt. Very excited to hear about your efforts.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you, Jackie. It's always I love listening to your analysis and your poetry. You're one of the very few people who can really do poetry and prose at the same time. So thank you so much. And Michelle, I'm so glad that you were able to join us. I know you had some technical difficulties. So y'all, I am so happy to bring into this space my dear friend, my mentor, somebody I am just so excited to share with you in a very short amount of time, Dishkama Humble. Michelle Vassell is the Wiyot Tribal Administrator. Basically, y'all, she's like the CEO of the tribe, right? Like she's responsible for all of it under the direction of the leadership. Michelle, I've brought up the slide. I've got it under control. Tell us what Dishkama means and what we're up to.
So Dishkama is a Wiyot word that basically means love. And so when we were looking for a name for our land trust, we were looking about the ideology around the type of work that we were interested in doing. And it really is about place-based healing and about coming together as a community and transforming our place. And so in order to do that, I've always learned as I grew up with this idea that everything you do in a good way. And whenever you're working on things, when you work on things, you put your feelings into the work that you do. And so you have to go about doing your work in a good way. Otherwise you put those things into it. So for instance, if you were feeling angry one day and you're going around doing the dishes, imagine yourself, slamming the dishes around, maybe, putting some negativity in the food you eat, and then spreads to everybody who eats the food. And so when we were looking at the name for this project, we decided to use Dishkama Humble because we wanted to really focus on caring and love and putting this good energy into our community. So Dishkama Humble is a Wiyot-led community land trust, and what we're looking at is really before you this intersections of different things: economic development, affordable housing, and ecological restoration. And it is very unique in that it's a community land trust that's being developed by a tribe, but also has within it non-tribal people who are community people from our area. So there's a little structure in the middle that shows how our board is managed. It's got 4 seats from the Wiyot tribe, and then there's seats from Cooperation Humboldt, our capital partners, and community members.
And Michelle, I want to just underscore something, y'all. So community land trust already exists, and it's a wonderful tactic. We encourage those. But what Michelle has just shared with you is the Wiyot Tribal Council has voted as government. And in my view, the government that is the proper authority for how to be in balance, because they have been here since time immemorial, they have 4 seats in perpetuity. It's not just 4 Wiyot individuals who start on the board. The Wiyot tribe has taken the power and responsibility to have 4 seats on a 7-member board in perpetuity. Cooperation Humboldt, their community partner, 1, and we are working class people, community organizers, but we have 1. We have invited our local community foundation to have 1 seat, and our impact investors have agreed to have only 1. So when we say it's Indigenous led, it is codified into its very structure. And that actually brings us, I think, Michelle, into the next stage that I really want to talk about, and that is that these projects are about a vision for healing generational trauma. And I would invite you to actually talk about that.
So the Wiyot tribe, you may know, many of you may not know that we're in Northern California in around Humboldt Bay. Our traditional lands are on and around Humboldt Bay. And this place was once stewarded by Wiyot people, and people lived in harmony with the environment here. They fished, they hunted, they tended indigenous plants for their use, and traded with not only local tribes, but there's an extensive trading network throughout the Americas. over time, that system has become out of balance. David, do you want to hit that?
I'm just going to name it. And I think Julia and Jackie have already talked about it, but we really have to be clear that the social, political, and economic institutions of settler colonialism were about extractive practices. And here in what is now known as Humboldt or Wiyot ancestral territory, they turned extraction of timber and fishing, started with gold, but the entire thing has led to an economic decline as well as the ecological destruction, and that these imbalances are systemic and structural. And as I often say, Michelle has heard me say it, I am an uninvited guest on Wiyot ancestral territory. But my mama, and my papa, Jackie, you'll appreciate that Southern for grandparents, right? But my mama and papa and my mama taught me, if you're going to be a guest, act right. And what I realize, and I say with humility, but also dignity, because I'm a good human, I'm a good person. But you know what? My society, my culture did not treat me or did not teach me how to act right. So I enter into this space with an intentional effort to decolonize myself, to uproot the thought processes around extraction and power over and white supremacy, because I have not been taught how to be an appropriate steward of this land. I have not been taught how to be a good ancestor for my own descendants. But here's the thing, I may be ignorant, but I am educable.
So the Wiyot tribe is known, we were the first people to purchase back and then receive back land from a municipal government without being, I guess, ordered to do so by a lawsuit. We were able to purchase back a 1.5 acre piece of property on Tuluwat, which is an island in the center of Humboldt Bay, which is the ceremonial center for Wiyot people and also the creation place for Wiyot people. And we spent 15 years restoring that place, which when we purchased the 1.5 acres was literally hazardous waste site. We spent 14 years working on that until it was finally cleaned up. As part of this process of restoring the land and ecological restoration, we really restored, we healed a rift that had been in our community for many, many, many years since the land was taken away around the time of the gold rush and at the time of a horrific massacre that happened on that island. And for many, many years, it was quiet, it was under, nobody wanted to look at that history, but together as a community, we worked on restoring our relationships and healing some of that trauma by restoring this place in Humboldt Bay.
And thank you, Michelle. And Michelle is always too humble, so I'm going to be the one to say it. And under Wiyot leadership, a hazardous waste site, the Wiyot tribe earned an EPA site reuse award. And I believe it was the first time in Region 9 that an Indigenous tribe had ever received that award.
It was the first time in EPA history a tribe had ever.
EPA history. I stand corrected. So, but the point I'm making, y'all, is it's not just a romanticization, right? Like the Wiyot people, just like Indigenous people everywhere, know how to do this. And as my dear friend Taj James often says, we have to learn to follow the people who know the way. And what I know is the Wiyot people here in this area know the way forward. And we're working together at the speed of trust, right? And we know, Michelle and I could literally give you an hour of how we have been in this community, what we've been doing together. I'm going to do it this much. We supported them during the honor tax. We supported them during the return of Tuluwat. We supported the Wiyot tribe during the fight to protect Sakayuit, yet one more sacred site that was under assault. And then Michelle and I are literally, during COVID, Jackie, mixing hand sanitizers in the parking lot waiting for a Cisco truck to come so that we could break down toilet paper and distribute it both to tribal members and community members who need it. And Michelle laughed and she said, you know, David, we keep showing up for each other, and I feel like we're doing that really well. What would it look like if we proactively decided what we wanted to do in this community? And that brings us to Dishkama, which is, and I'll turn this over to you, Michelle, what our big picture, what we're looking to do.
Well, when people think about community land trusts, they usually think of, there's two different types of community land trusts. One is more of maintaining land as green space and maybe restoring it. And another type is affordable housing. We base our land trust has both of these components and also an economic development component. We're really trying to reshape the way that we do business in our area and tie this into this long-term vision of the future.
And so I want to just hit the projects because look, you notice we started with relationships. We started with the vision. We have a community plan that's been developed over a long time, but our projects are super exciting. One project snapshot, we're working with the city of Eureka. As Michelle likes to say, we're reclaiming a parking lot and restoring it to paradise, right? You know, that great Sheryl Crow song, they paved paradise and turned it into a parking lot. Well, we're reversing that. So imagine a 4 to 6 story mid-rise laminated mass timber housing project in the city of Eureka for 40 to 50 dwellings, affordable housing. Oh, but wait, we're the only developers writing and codifying into our proposal affordable in perpetuity. For those of you who know how affordable housing is normally done, it's normally only 25 or 30 years and then it reverts to market rates. Not if you fool with Dishkama, y'all, because whenever you roll with us, you roll with a transformational approach. But wait, there's more. There's the eco housing village. We're looking at a 9-acre site for 40 to 50 acres that will literally basically recreate the vision of a Wiyot tribal village, except for in modern times. So taking, like, imagine the best of the eco-spiritual cosmology of the Wiyot tribe, the best of the science associated with climate mitigation and adaptation, and turning it into reality. The last thing that I want to say project-wise is the Dishkama Innovation Center. This is yet another mass timber building project with 20 dwelling units, again, housing above it, but below it, workforce development that will do sustainable forestry. We'll have community retail and urban agricultural facilities. Michelle, you want to talk about our workforce training?
Well, as what we're building into our work is, we're calling it deep green. We're not just building, we're not just using passive energy systems like solar energy and things like that. We're actually using green technologies in the building trades. And we're also trying to actually build green or plant life into, or green space into our projects. So all of those things require training in our area. As we develop them, we're developing the training that goes along with them.
And so our invitation, business development, operational efficiency, and capital fundraising. We are inviting folks to co-invest with us. We are, our long-term plan for this community over the next 10 to 15 years, about $10 million in straight philanthropy, about $30 million from venture capital and private equity, and about $60 million in debt. And what's really important is that our anchors include Michelle as the tribal administrator, and remember, the entire tribal council is standing with us. I represent Cooperation Humboldt. We have Taj James and Ruben Hernandez of Full Spectrum Capital Partners. By the way, we have a memorandum of commitment, not merely a memorandum of understanding. We're playing an infinite game, y'all. Like, we're transforming this place. So there's the organizational anchors, but I just want to point out, we've got our local CDFI, the Arcata Economic Development Corporation, and our SBDC, who's already paying Cooperation Humboldt to develop worker-owned cooperatives, and both College of the Redwoods, Humboldt Area Foundation. We have our local builders, we have our county, we have the city, we have arts teams, and take a look. We've got the Humboldt County Treasurer. We've got the Director of the Redwood Region Economic Development Commission. We've got an investment manager. We've got HSU's business professor. Danny Kelly is the Board of Trustees for Humboldt, College of the Redwoods Board of Trustees. We've got Ross Welch, the Executive Director. We've got an appropriate technology engineering professor. Y'all, what I'm getting at is we've got the team that is steeped in the community, and we are building a vision and a plan. We have the priorities, and for us, the projects will flow once we have decolonized ourselves and made a commitment to put into practice what you heard Julia Kem and Jackie Peterson start at the beginning. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so mumuch, David. Thank you so much, Michelle. What a powerful start to our webinar. I'm really excited personally to continue following what you're doing with Discma Humboldt, and I'm sure that's just one of many efforts that you're leading. So yeah, very inspiring. I'm going to keep things moving along here, and we'll now invite Nuantara Key to our virtual stage to share more about investments for equitable adaptation.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, first, just want to thank Local Government Commission and all the partners who've been involved in pulling off such a successful California Adaptation Forum, a virtual one this year, but a very big thank you to everybody also who participated and engaged. It's been a wonderful opportunity. I also want to thank Jackie, Michelle, and David for your presentations. Very inspiring work happening. And thank you so much for sharing. So I'm Nuantara Key. I'm Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I am going to speak a little bit about some of the funding that has come through this year's climate budget, the historic budget that was just recently signed. But before I dive into that, I want to just give a little bit of context of our role in our office and some of the priorities that we're driving on in our resilience and adaptation work through our office. So next slide, please. So for background, for those of you who may not know, out of our office, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, we run our Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, which really serves as the hub for interagency resilience, policy alignment, and practice across the state. And importantly, that alignment and collaboration, as spelled out in our enabling statute, recognizes the importance of collaboration across agencies and organizations, as well as sectors and across scales across the state. We absolutely recognize the state alone cannot build the resilience and address the climate impacts that we're all facing here in California, and it requires true collaboration and partnership to be able to see the resilience outcomes that we need to across the state and in communities. So we really work to drive alignment across scales and sectors and with communities throughout the state. We have a couple requirements that I'm just going to very quickly highlight here in terms of our charge for our program. The first is we convene a technical advisory council, which serves as the only public body in state government that's actually explicitly charged with addressing climate adaptation and resilience. And I'll talk a little bit more about our council here in a second. But the second is our adaptation clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse is intended to support a community of practice across the state, pulling together resources and guidance, information, tools, etc., as well as case studies on successful projects across the state. And then lastly here, just wanted to highlight, we also have an important role in leading implementation of the climate change assessments. I'll talk a little bit more about those as well. So that's just a little bit of context in terms of our role and where we sit and big picture, but next slide, please. So our council, I want to just recognize here for a quick second, serves our program and really guides and informs the work that we do. And as I mentioned before, because the council really serves a very important role as being that public venue to bring perspectives together, brings together a number of different perspectives, including state agencies, regional, local, and tribal governments, community-based organizations and nonprofits, a number of boundary organizations and research institutes, as well as private sector. So really bringing together the cross-sector of perspectives that need to be at the table to be driving solutions on the ground. Next slide, please. And now, fundamental to our work through our council, and actually from the very beginning of our work in establishing our program, needed to recognize the importance of ensuring that as we're looking to address the impacts of climate change, that we are driving towards equitable solutions across all our adaptation and resilience work. And one of the very first things that our council did when we first launched our program a few years ago was chart a vision for what a resilient California looks like. And the vision itself, while we don't have the full text here, really takes a systems view, recognizing that building resilience and addressing climate impacts requires investments in communities and the need to ensure that all people and communities have the capacity to not only respond to specific climate impacts or disasters, but actually the capacity to adapt and thrive in a changing climate. It also recognizes, our vision recognizes that we have to be making investments in natural systems as well as our built and infrastructure systems, but really recognizing, again, a holistic, whole of community approach on resilience. I also want to highlight that while having a vision was very important to lay out this kind of foundation of what it is we're working towards, what is the big picture, we also acknowledged that we needed principles to guide how we got to that vision, recognizing that the process is equally as important as the outcome. And so we've kind of summarized here the different principles that guide and inform our work. But at the top of the list was, again, ensuring that we are working towards equitable outcomes, fostering community resilience, and protecting and enabling and building capacity within communities who have the fewest resources to respond to climate impacts. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of background in terms of our council and our work there, developing our vision and principles. But now moving to our adaptation clearinghouse, and I'm going to cover this one quickly, but I would be remiss if I didn't just put the link to the website up here. One of the pieces of the adaptation clearinghouse that I want to point people to is building out, we've built out equity and climate justice topic page on the adaptation clearinghouse, pointing to a number of resources from across the state to help us all understand how to actually operationalize and integrate equity into our adaptation and resilience work. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. And Nikki Caravelli, thank you, just put the link to that page on our website, but I just wanted to share that as a resource. So next slide. So moving to the budget now with that background and context. The historic climate change budget that was just recently passed, the $15 billion climate budget, really makes unprecedented investments in strengthening community capacity to thrive in a changing climate. And I've just pulled onto this slide a few of the investments, and specifically the investments that are coming through our office, but there are a number of other programs that are funded to also drive on these outcomes that I mentioned. So I want to just highlight here, First on the list, our office received significant infusion of funding to really scale our approach through our office in supporting communities with the tools and resources that they need to be able to drive on equitable adaptation outcomes. And I want to highlight one effort that we are very excited to be working on and in the early stages on, and absolutely invite people to reach out and engage with us on this, is developing a platform to help us understand who is vulnerable to climate impacts and why. And I just want to reference back to Jackie's amazing framing at the beginning, that understanding vulnerability to climate impacts isn't just looking at, where specific climate impacts will happen, but also recognizing the underlying socioeconomic and political conditions, as well as, access to resources and infrastructure, et cetera, that are driving underlying inequities within communities. And that needs to be part of how we understand vulnerability, but also being able to use that to inform our investments in adaptation to be building capacity within communities. So that's one of the many things that we're going to be building out through this funding, and again, really invite opportunity for engagement in that process. The next is investment into the 5th California climate change assessments. This funding is going to support a suite of a number of different resources. The first is investing in primary research that will help us answer some of the key questions we have out there on how to build resilience and adapt to a changing climate. And I just want to highlight that as we're looking to implement the assessment, we are really looking to build on the successes of the Strategic Growth Council's research program that is really centered community partnership in research and advancing, as some of the speakers had earlier before me mentioned, the importance of co-creation and the co-creation of knowledge and solutions. So really excited to be able to have funding to be able to support that approach as we implement the assessment. Another thing on the assessment that I'm very excited about and want to highlight very quickly is we secured through the budget funding for the first of its kind tribal climate science research program that will really allow us to be able to provide funding and resources to tribes to be partners again in this approach on co-creation and collaboration on climate science and research, but also recognizing the importance of building capacity and funding to bring in different knowledge streams that are helping us identify the solutions we need within communities. So really quickly, I'm going to touch on the other two funding programs. I think I'm running out of time here, so I will move along. But we also received funding to support adaptation planning and resilience activities for communities across the state to be charting kind of long-term vision and resilience adaptation planning needs. And then the second to last here is standing up a new regional climate resilience planning and implementation grant to really look at how we scale solutions to a regional scale and approach, recognizing many of the solutions we need to respond to the impacts of climate change have to happen and be coordinated at a regional level. So happy to answer more questions on that when we get to the Q&A. And then the last piece that I just wanted to flag here, we have funding coming into next year's budget to also stand up an extreme heat and community resilience program that will specifically be looking to drive on the risk that we have seen from extreme heat that is already touching every community across the state and really responding to that. So that is a quick summary of the budget. I'm very happy to go into more detail and on any of these in the Q&A. So next slide, please. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here today and to be a part of this amazing panel. So Julia, I will hand it back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tara, for joining us. I know there are a lot of things going on at the state level right now, so appreciate you making the time. Just going to keep things moving so we have as much time as possible for the panel discussion. So next, I'll invite Katie to join us on this virtual stage.
Hi there. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be speaking with all of you today. So first, I'm going to tell you, my name is Katie Lipiecki. As Julie mentioned, I work with FEMA. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what FEMA does, and then I will discuss some of our challenges, our opportunities, and some key points that I hope you'll keep in mind as you're executing adaptation strategies within your organizations. So high level, FEMA supports the whole community through our headquarters office, but then also we have 10 regional offices and long-term recovery offices that get stood up following major disaster declarations. I'm based out of the Region 9 office, and our area of operation includes Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, and the Pacific Territories of American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam. We also work with more than 150 tribal governments whose lands and their interests fall within this area I just mentioned. So our mission is pretty simple, but also pretty broad in scope. We help people before, during, and after disasters. Disasters always start and end locally. State and federal resources are used to augment local, nonprofit, and other private funding sources. But it's important to know that we do not replace other sources of disaster help. While the federal government does provide some resources, insurance is really the principal form of disaster funding, especially when private property is involved. And I cannot underscore enough that insurance is really the best way to be made more whole following a disaster. Our region is susceptible to a myriad of risks, such as earthquakes, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, landslides, volcanoes, and man-made disasters as well. And many of these are increasing in severity and frequency due to climate change. NOAA has been tracking billion-dollar disasters going back to 1980, and on average, there were about 6 events that exceeded $1 billion in a given year. However, since 2016, that number has increased to more than $15 billion events a year. That's a really short time frame for it to see that type of an increase. Climate change is making natural disasters more frequent, more intense, and more destructive, and is really one of the most urgent crises that we need to address so that we can ensure that we're mitigating future risks and building communities that are able to be more adaptable and more resilient. As an emergency agency, FEMA must face the challenges that climate change poses to our mission every day, and encourage investments to be made that reduce risks to the impacts that we're experiencing as a result of the rapidly changing climate. So our success, and I think the success of the communities across the country, really does rest in mitigating the worst impacts of disasters before they occur. Developing resilient communities ahead of an incident can reduce the loss of life and also economic disruption as well. So one of the most, I think, effective forms of hazard mitigation is through tools that we already have in place, land use and building codes. Effectively, where and how you build can be the most important decisions that are made in any community. There's a study by the National Institute of Building Sciences that showed that for every dollar that was spent on mitigation in new code construction, $11 are saved in disaster repair and recovery. Some states are really ahead of the curve in breaking the cycle of destruction, repair, and then disaster again, by adopting modern building codes that protect property and people when we do see these natural disasters. So California is one of those states that has been a pioneer in this field, and it has modern hazard resistant building codes that have been in place here since about the 1990s. An estimated $1.8 billion has been avoided in property losses over 20 years associated with California's modern building codes that we've seen during earthquake and flooding events. So these modern building codes address many concerns, including public health, safety, resiliency, and affordability even. While there is a perception that building more resiliently can be more expensive, really the construction features that allow buildings to survive following natural disasters, I don't think are unattainable. On average, it's really just about 1 to 2% of total building construction costs that get added by building in some of these more modern features. And this is something that government officials, nonprofits, and practitioners can continue to advocate for, going above and beyond some of these standards and influence through mechanisms such as updating local community plans and then also building codes. For risks that already exist, though, FEMA does have resources that can be used to mitigate or reduce some of these risks that can be done through planning, but also through infrastructure projects. We have several funding programs. I think right now I'm going to focus on two, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or the BRIC program, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or also called HMGP. So these are two programs that aim to buy down risk, increase resiliency, and really strengthen our nation's efforts to build really culture preparedness across the country. To provide communities with additional financial support for mitigation projects, this is pretty exciting, and that FEMA is expanding both the BRIC and the HMGP programs. President Biden announced that he's increasing the funding available for the BRIC program from $500 million to $1 billion in available funding over the course of 2021 fiscal year. And additionally, back in August, there was an announcement that $3.5 billion in funding nationally is being made available for HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So with the growing climate change crisis that's facing our country right now, this HMGP dollars and these BRIC dollars are providing funding to states, tribes, and territories to identify and execute mitigation projects so that we can begin collectively reducing impacts to climate change on our communities. So some of the things that are eligible include projects that are related to property acquisition, elevation, structural retrofits, wildfire mitigation activities and vegetation management, and other types of projects. And then additionally, funding can also be used to help develop hazard mitigation plans, which are criteria for eligibility for this funding. So the funding can be used to help build those plans. And also there's some pretty exciting new types of projects that includes building local capability and capacity as well. Many communities in California do have a local hazard mitigation plan in place. These are plans where community members assess the risks to natural hazards and then develop strategies to reduce those risks. In California alone, there are over, I think, 10,000 unique projects that are included in these hazard mitigation plans that really are trying to reduce these risks. So mitigating existing risks doesn't always have the same payout as building resiliently. If you remember that, $11 saved. Another National Institute of Building Sciences study did show that for every dollar spent on hazard mitigation, an average of $6 in future disaster-related costs are saved. Those are real dollars. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about BRIC or HMGP, I'd encourage you to coordinate with the state hazard mitigation officer within the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services to learn a little bit more about the funding and potential for submitting project applications for it. So with COVID and then the economic impacts of the pandemic, we recognize that there are difficulties increasing costs even incrementally for work related to planning, land use, building codes, and hazard mitigation projects. And coming up with the cost share can also be challenging because there is a 25% cost share associated with accessing some of these funds. But the funds are being made available and at unprecedented levels because the importance of this work, it really does, as I think you all agree, needs to be addressed today, not tomorrow. And we're also taking a look when thinking about mitigation and serving communities. Really, unity, equity, and empathy remain key principles that we are looking at and incorporating into our practices and funding opportunities. We're really committed to prioritizing underserved communities. We know that underserved communities are going to suffer more frequently from disaster events. I think it's important then to consider how the impacts of climate change on these communities and really across our programs can be used to prioritize supporting these communities. The commitments for better serving underrepresented communities really does align with the Biden administration. The FEMA, through these funding opportunities, is encouraging our states to prioritize making investments that benefit these economically disadvantaged populations and those communities that are disproportionately vulnerable to communities. Additionally, we're pretty proud here in Region 9 that we've been working internally to better understand some of the historic bases of these inequities that we're seeing. And actually last year in the region, our regional administrator promoted that, taking a look and trying to just educate ourselves. We were all provided with copies of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, so that we could better really understand how government programs and policies that we implement do have real and lasting impacts on our communities. As I think you're probably all aware, often the most vulnerable among us live in the most high-risk places. They are the least likely to be able to evacuate in a disaster, or cover a few nights in a hotel, or have insurance, or really understand or get access to some of these grant programs. We're working to better understand the obstacles that are faced by these underserved populations to build their resilience. And with that, we're also encouraging other jurisdictions to think about what opportunities they have to partner across jurisdictional boundaries on things like grant projects that holistically address risk, because wildfire risk doesn't stop at the border, nor does flood risk, nor does earthquake risk. So, thinking about how, creative partnerships with underrepresented communities and communities that are a little stronger in some of the implementation and administration of grant programs, that could help share technical expertise, the administrative burden of managing a grant, and better build the capability of their neighbors. So, in sum, there's clearly a lot of work ahead of us, but I do see a ton of opportunity. Climate adaptation, social and environmental justice, hazard mitigation and emergency management. These are the focus of our work, and really, focus now, national focus. I think it's an exciting time to be in our fields doing what we're doing here, because I think there's, I see momentum. I see that there's an acknowledgement of these issues, and then a commitment across all levels of government to take action on some of these challenges, this crisis that's facing us. And I think, I say that, and then my optimism is because, importantly, there's funding to back this up. Funding for BRIC and HMGP nationally represent really an unprecedented infusion of funding. And I think, we just heard from California, representative from California also, indicating that there is also unprecedented infusions of state funding. This type of funding, can help us better prepare for the impacts of climate change and these disaster events. There is a slightly different challenge here then. We have all this funding and we still had, limited resources from a staffing perspective. So how do we take advantage of this? We recognize that workloads are, we're all stretched thin across all levels of government. And we internally are trying to pivot to increase our capabilities to support our states, our communities, our tribes, our territories, and how to execute these. We know that mitigating and managing risk can't be done alone, needs to look beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and it's really a shared responsibility. And it's great to be advancing the shared mission with all of you. I'll stop here. I do look forward to the discussion, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Katie. Really appreciate you being here. It's always great to have a federal perspective. With that, I'd like to invite all panelists back to our virtual stage so we can get to some of the questions that have been coming in. There are actually a couple of questions that I know some folks responded to through the in the module, but I actually wanted to elevate those. So one was specifically for Jackie, David, and Michelle, but this might be something that others might want to respond to. There's been a bigger focus on community capacity building in terms of program and funding priorities. Just curious to hear your thoughts on capacity building programs that could help other communities implement some types of solutions that were presented and other community-driven solutions. We'll open it up to see if anybody wants to share some ideas.
You go first, Jackie.
Okay, so a couple of examples are, so Institute for Local Self-Reliance is an example of a place that works with communities to really do whatever it is that they have decided they want to do in terms of advancing as a term goes, self-reliance. So so I'll say that. Also in specific areas. So we worked a lot, as I mentioned before, with a group called Climate Central. Together, we have worked on helping communities to be able to predict their risk for sea level rise. We worked together on how to overlay the kind of topographical analysis around sea level rise risk with what type of vulnerabilities that there might be in communities, whether the communities are in floodplains or the communities have poor housing stock or it's next to a toxic facility or whatever. So anyway, that's another place that does good technical assistance with frontline communities. The groups like the Climate Justice Alliance works with communities on kind of aligned transformational work as well. Those are a couple. I'll hand it back and I'll think of more if necessary, but those are a few. And yeah, and I'll also say too that the Chisholm Legacy Project that our work is actually to put together a resource hub for frontline climate justice activism. So we are going to actually be putting together all the groups that we can find out there and putting them in one database on our website. So that'll be a good resource to find this type of thing. And of course, the cake is a good database to check out as well. Thank you.
I just want to thank you, Jackie. What I want to underscore is that if there is a community-based solution that is not just some smart person working with another smart person, but you really do have a community plan that has come from a participatory bottom-up process that is informed by the science, and then you have the priorities. And I wrote it into the chat, but I really want to say it out loud. Like, y'all, I've been in social change work for my entire adult life. I have never experienced this level of openness from government at the local, county, state, and federal level to genuinely partner with community-based organizations to try to look for solution-oriented approaches. So, like, that's just me being straight up. Like, we are in an interstitial space. This is a historic conjuncture. We should take advantage of it with vision, sincerity, but also clarity. The second thing that I really want to underscore that I think gets lost sometime, and that is it requires a truly decolonized lens. That it's not just projects. The projects are critical as the building blocks, but we have to get back into right relationship with ourselves, with other humans and the land, and the projects will follow, right? Like if we really rethink that, and I'm not trying to be, sycophantic, Michelle, but you teach me that every day when we work together, when you remind me to sort of like, if we do it the right way, the right things will come.
Well, and I think too, not taking into, not focusing so much about the money to do it. Dave and I were just on a call yesterday and somebody was talking about, we were talking about land back, and the person we were talking to said something along the lines of, a lot of times this is land you don't want. People want to give you land that you don't want. Well, I said, well, we want to know what we're getting into whenever we take into the tribe another piece of land. But just because it's ecologically like a ecological disaster doesn't mean we don't want it, because part of our mission is to restore this place. And so like I was talking to David the other day about this. If I had known, if I wasn't so young at the time that we started the Tulawa project, and had any clue how much money that was going to take to restore that place, or how much time it would take, and how much, it ended up being for me most of my career working on that. But if you look at it in the scheme of things, I just happened to be alive at the time that was completed, but that actually took several generations to get to where we're at today. So looking about like how much time it's going to take you and how much money it's going to take you, you kind of got to throw that to the side and really think about what you want, what should be here, what this place should be like, and focus on that in a positive way.
Great. Thank you, Jackie, David, Michelle. There was another question, I think it's in the answer section now, but I'm also curious about this one. A question for all: what has enabled you to stay engaged in climate and or equity work? Do you have any personal resilience practices you can share? Just recognizing that, just thinking back to some of the bios that I went over earlier on, many of you have been involved in this work for 10 plus years, multiple decades. I don't know if y'all have been facing this or hearing this, but I've certainly heard from many adaptation practitioners that it's challenging. Just come show up every day and kind of being faced by all these barriers and more climate disasters. So I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
I'll jump into this one if you don't mind. So, when I, started my career, and I think like many of you probably, we cared about the climate change crisis, but not, it was not, I think, a universal fact. I think having continued, to operate in the government, one thing that, inspires me particularly recently is that now there is a focus, and like I said in my presentation, funding to back it up. So while previously we had been advocating for limited resources and trying to, say we have big important work to do, and really trying to use limited staffing resources and then limited funding resources and encourage communities to, focus on some of these things. I think it's inspiring and exciting, again, to be here now because there's funding. And there's recognition that this is important and this is what we need to be focusing on right
now. So I'll toss in and say kind of a bit of a suite of things. One is it can be interesting going from one community that has these relatively devastating circumstances and then being able to, what kind of keeps me going is being able to then go to the next community that used to be that community. And then they've evolved, and being able to then go back to that community and say, here's what this community is doing, and helping people to be able to see their possibilities and then to see that progression. So it really helps to, when I go into a devastating situation, to know that there's hope, there's models, there's precedent for people kind of rising out of those circumstances. And so that really helps a lot with the kind of emotional weight of it. And then on a practical standpoint, I've started to do a lot of meetings by hiking, like hiking meetings. So like jogging people out into the trails of the Baltimore Arboretum has been really restorative these days. So, and then also, I mean, just even to Katie's point about resources, it also helped to start my own thing with the Chisholm Legacy Project, because now there are, like, where I was before, it was just super, I would fall asleep every night on my laptop and wake up in the morning, finishing that sentence that I fell asleep on. And so it was just literally just nonstop every day, all day. But now with the Chisholm Legacy Project, I do have the resources and the flexibility to be able to now hire people and to not be, so crushed by the weight of it all. So all of those practical and other things has really helped with personal resilience. Thank you.
I'll just add on quickly two quick things. First, maybe echoing a little bit of one of Jackie's, is taking time to celebrate successes, even if they are small in scale of kind of the big picture of everything we need to do, but really taking time again to celebrate successes where they happen, and the partnerships and collaboration where they are, and the value that comes through those. So trying to be mindful of doing that in our day-to-day work. And the second one just left my brain, so maybe I'll turn it to somebody else and then it'll come back to me. Yes, but I'll add the other one in if I remember. Apologies.
Jackie, I loved your hiking. I call those walk and talks, where you have meetings while you're hiking and walking around, because it's really good to get out and not be stuck at your desk all day. But I feel like I guess I've come to an age in life where I was a panelist in another conference, and somebody that was the next speaker happened to be somebody I went to college with, and she mentioned, because I sat in hers and she sat in on mine, and she said something along the line of, "Oh wow, it's really cool to see things that we were working on when we were college students happen like in real life." And I think that's, for me, I think that like keeps me going. You don't win every battle, but you do see, when you start to see things happen, it might take 20 years, but they do happen eventually. And when you start to see that I think just one of those can keep you going for a long time.
Tara, I don't know if that second thought came back. Nope, not yet. Cliffhanger for folks. Stay tuned for our next webinar. I know we're quickly running out of time, and I want to be just be mindful of that. So just wanted to wrap up with the final question, thinking about what the theme was for CAF this year, just thinking about the grand adaptation challenges. We know the climate adaptation field is in a constant state of evolution, and from my experience in working with the adaptation community, which involves quite a number of different industries and types of professionals, and not just planners and engineers, but also community leaders and CBOs and tribes, and goes on and on and on. We've been seeing the field kind of adapt itself and the community adapting to new challenges. So calls for integrating equity, we're seeing those conversations kind of enter in the mainstream. Calls to focus on financing and and insurance, and we're seeing more research and more discussions around how we can tap into these different types of instruments. So I'm curious to hear from folks, what do you see as the next grand challenge for adaptation practitioners? Is there anything that's not getting enough attention currently that you think should be prioritized?
Maybe unless I'm cutting the line here, I can start here. I think one thing that I would highlight is the urgency to get ahead of the curve on the impacts that we're already seeing, and just the accelerated changes that are coming. And so, I think recognizing that if we continue to be in a reactive state, we're never going to catch up, and we're not going to be able to make the long-term investments in community resilience, in building capacity, if we're always trying to catch up and respond to disasters after the fact. And so I think, that's a really complex and really, difficult thing to shift our systems and shift approach, but also shift our thinking to really be recognizing the importance of long-term capacity building, long-term resilience work. Otherwise, we won't accomplish, the big picture on everything that people have been talking about here today. And we also will just have fewer and fewer resources available to invest in those long-term things if we're always trying to catch up after. So really invite everybody in partnership here in this work, and thinking about how do we identify the solutions to really pivot and move towards that long-term kind of proactive approach to building resilience.
Yeah, I'll second that. 100% agree. And I guess, I don't know if it's the challenge we're not thinking about. I think we are thinking about it and talking about it, but it's still, I think, an unsolved one. Thinking about when disasters happen and looking at what our future, looks like as we start beginning to see the impacts of, sea level rise and increased, impacts from disasters, where and how we should be rebuilding, I think becomes a really interesting and challenging discussion. How do we maintain our communities? Our communities aren't just the buildings that occupy, a boundary. They are, they have a real sense of place, history, and people love their communities. And so how do we maintain that? And when and where is the right time to think about, do we pull back a little bit on this block, relocation, retreat, but, also remembering that these are places that we love, and how do we maintain that sense of place while we're really, making some really tough decisions.
Well, David can tell you that I always talk about place-based healing and about, for people that do work with individuals who've experienced trauma, we often talk about, trauma-based care, but I feel like our environment has been traumatized, and people as a result are experiencing that. There's been part of the history of our lands, as Jackie was talking about earlier, there's this trauma piece that's just been left there, and it's ugly. And we have to get at that, finding ways to heal that trauma in the place that we live. And I think that's a really important piece that's kind of left out. Also, I think that when you heal places, environmentally, you heal people. There's something to be said about working side by side with people in your community. Also, I think it's important to give people small steps that they can do, or little things that they can do every day. As a whole, as a society, I think we're losing hope. You talk to teenagers, it's a sad world we live in. We have to change that.
So as often happens, Michelle has me literally on the verge of tears now, but I just want to own that, because part of what my own process is to allow the grief to happen, because this is trauma. And what I know, and a hat tip to Chris Peters of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Development, I descend from Indigenous people, just like you do. Like whoever I'm talking to, whoever's hearing my voice, we all descend from Indigenous people who once lived in right relationship with each other and with the land and in balance. And Chris said, David, I feel sorry for you, because when I say that the trees are talking to me, it's not a metaphor. I can hear it. And it makes me feel sad for you, because I know you're a good human, David. I remember he said, you're a good person, but I feel sad for you because you can't hear it, but it's your birthright. You're supposed to be able to hear it. And your job, and it's harder for you, but your job is to remember that it's in your DNA, and you can do that work. So that's what place-based healing means to me, is to acknowledge that my ancestors lived in right relationship in Scotland and Ireland hundreds of years ago. They were brutalized and traumatized by the English Empire, driven off their lands. They then came to this country, or this nation, this land, and traumatized and brutalized people and drove them off of their lands. That shit is trauma. Right? It's generational trauma that has been both received and caused, and we're all traumatized, right? And if we can, with humility and kindness and compassion, let ourselves be the best version of ourselves, we can heal this place, we can heal the land, we heal each other, we heal ourselves. That's how I would answer that.
I think our time is up, so I'm not going to really say anything. But I think I think others have said it all. And yes, so okay, Julie, I'll head it back off to you.
My goodness, what a powerful way to wrap up a pretty powerful session overall. I just want to take a moment to really thank each and every one of you for joining this webinar. Especially to all of our speakers for showing up so authentically. I get a lot of hope in just hearing about the work that you're all doing in the communities that you serve and that you're part of, and just knowing that we have so many others like yourselves in this community working to address climate change, address the systemic issues that we're seeing pop up everywhere, and just get us to a better future. So I'm just going to keep it short. We'll be sharing all of the resources from the entire series next week, so please stay tuned. And huge thanks again for everyone just taking the time to join us. With that, we will let you go, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.